Welcome to the Solar Rights Alliance podcast, where we talk to you about the freedom and independence of solar and how you can defend your solar investment. I'm Dave Rosenfeld, the Executive Director of the Solar Rights Alliance.
And I'm Cailey Underhill, Advocacy and Development Director of the Solar Rights Alliance.
This week, the California Public Utilities Commission released a report, although perhaps one could call it a hit piece. The report was supposed to be about why are California's electricity prices so high, and what are the actual solutions to do about it. And instead, the report didn't say very much about what the actual cause of electricity rates are, but it said an awful lot about blaming rooftop solar for high electricity rates. And so that report came out, and then shortly right after, a powerful committee of state lawmakers held a hearing where members of the CPUC came to present the results of the report, and they also heard from other experts. Cailey, you watched this hearing, right?
I sure did. It was a little over 3 hours long, and I want to just start by saying that that report from the California Public Utility Commission was such a shame and such a sham. It directly blamed customers, rooftop solar customers, for rising rates, when we know, everyone knows, that the real reason rates are rising is increased utility spending on poles and wires, and that CPUC report relied on a long debunked set of data that many energy economists have just taken apart, totally dismantled, and demonstrated that rooftop solar is a benefit to the grid, to everyone, saves everyone money, and that the real driver of these rising rates is utility spending. One interesting thing about this Senate hearing is that really for the first time, legislators started to pick up on that. So you heard,
that's interesting.
Yeah, it really was. So you heard legislators start to connect the dots between increased utility spending on poles and wires, the increase in their profits, the increase in the rates. And it was mentioned by some of the experts that were brought in that this spending has increased far beyond demand, that the peak demand has been flat and utility spending has wildly increased over time. So that was really a bright spot in this meeting, that for the first time, legislators are saying this, hearing this, that truth is really coming out loud and clear. It was also the case that legislators really grilled the California Public Utility Commission and PG&E in particular. And I gotta say, as a consumer, that was great to see.
When infrastructure is built, the costs are passed on to the ratepayers. Additionally, the IOUs receive a rate of return. You referenced it earlier. I want to highlight that PG&E, as well as several of the other companies that have been discussed here, has actually made billions in profits. Is that part of your analysis when you are doing 6 rate increases?
So that was pretty impressive. Unfortunately, though, if I was a legislator and I walked away from this hearing, I think what I would have been left with is this impression that there are a series of reasons why rates are rising, and that increased utility spending is one of them, but it's not the only one. So wildfire spending was mentioned a lot, and of course, several bad actors there blamed rooftop solar customers for rising rates, especially those who got solar a while ago, who did the right thing early, who helped California start to be on the path to meeting its clean energy goals, that those were the folks who got blamed. So I think there's a real concern here that legislators walked away with this sort of smorgasbord of things that might be driving up rates, when really we know the real driver of rates is increased utility spending, and that one of the things that they are naming as a reason why rates are rising is rooftop solar, and that's a real problem.
Yeah, that sounds like a huge red flag. I mean, I get it. It is good that we're hearing legislators start to connect the dots between rates, high rates, and out-of-control utility spending. I mean, that does feel like a victory in some ways, because my experience and observation is that lawmakers have not made that connection up to this point.
Right. It's like they got half. They got half the story, but not the full picture.
Yeah, because if they're still walking away feeling like, okay, but rooftop solar is still also a big part of the problem, then they really haven't gotten the message. They've been really horribly misled, if that's the case, if they're walking away from that. Because again, just to, like, you've said this, Cailey, but I think it bears repeating. the rates, literally the reason why rates are so high is precisely because of utility overspending on poles and wires. There is no real other reason for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Utilities make an 8 to 10% profit for all new spending they do building poles and wires. And so they're inherently incentivized to do so. And as a result, their spending, I think, as you know, has increased by 300% over the last 20 years, even though peak electricity demand has been flat over that same time period. And the reason why it's been flat is because of rooftop solar.
Yeah.
So if anything, rooftop solar is helping to keep utilities from spending even more money. And going forward, it can be a huge way that we can reduce the need to have to rely on all these long distance power lines that are causing wildfires to begin with. Did any of that come out in the hearing? Was there anyone talking about that?
Some of it did come out. So expert energy economist Dr. Richard McCann, who has done substantial work on this, a decorated energy economist, an expert among experts, has done a really deep dive into some of the most egregious claims against rooftop solar and has really helped to debunk and dismantle those claims. And he was there and spoke very eloquently on this very topic, really tried to drive home the point for legislators that the main reason rates are rising is because of increased utility spending way out of line with the actual demand that the grid needs to meet. So that was definitely there. I also want to just, shout out to some of our various, folks in these spaces, coalition partners who were there at the end at the public comment, who also spoke in favor of rooftop solar and pointed out that rooftop solar has actually saved all customers $1.49 billion in 2024 alone.
Stop right there. So
yeah.
Rooftop solar saved. Some people listening to this, that might be the first time they're hearing that number.
Yeah.
Rooftop solar saved all ratepayers in 2024 almost $1.5 billion in 2024 alone. Can you just quickly pause and just describe in a nutshell how that happens?
So one of the other speakers in this Senate hearing was the Public Advocate's Office. The Public Advocate's Office certainly sounds like they advocate for the public, right? They sound like they're an independent group.
Yeah.
Right? That's what it sounds like. It's a good name, but what's really happening here is that the Public Advocate's Office literally sits inside of the California Public Utility Commission building. The head of the Public Advocate's Office is a political appointee. And on top of that, they're not beholden to a board of directors or to donors. So the work that they are putting out into the world should not be considered the work of an independent watchdog.
They're just an arm of the CPUC.
They're an arm of the CPUC.
What's the difference between the two of them?
Yeah, they are an arm of the CPUC. And so what they did is put out this wild claim that rooftop solar customers cost everybody else $8.5 billion in 2024. And that claim was so extreme that really for the first time, several thought leaders and political leaders stepped back and said, "What, are you sure that sounds like a lot?" And because that happened, the PAO finally had to show their math and be like, well, this is how we got here. This is why we think this. And that allowed Dr. McCann and a dozen other energy economists to actually look into the spreadsheets, the actual data and the math that they were using to get to this wild conclusion. And because he did that, McCann was able to see that actually they made a series of really, really big billion-dollar mistakes. So, for example, they made the assumption that all rooftop solar users pay one flat rate. They don't. They made the assumption that there are no rooftop solar customers on the CARE electricity subsidy bill program. 15% of rooftop solar users are on that program.
People get solar to cut their electricity bill.
Of course.
And so it would make sense that people on the CARE program would do that.
Cut their electricity bill.
Noting that 60% of all solar customers are middle and working class. And it's actually working middle class people who are the most desperate to get out from under these electricity bills. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but
bingo. Yes.
Who are rooftop solar customers in California, it gets grossly distorted by the utilities and by what we see with the CPUC. But anyway, continue, because we're talking about how is it that rooftop solar customers can save all ratepayers $1.5 billion?
Right, exactly. So, and I really appreciate that you made that point, because in ignoring a chunk of rooftop solar customers. That's part of how this claim became so wildly inflated. The other thing they ignored is that rooftop solar users pay their fair share of the grid. The Public Advocate's Office made the assumption that rooftop solar users have a $0 bill. And for all you folks out there who are listening, right? Some of you may well have Dave's expression on your face right now because you know that that just isn't true. You pay a bill. And the average bill is between $80 to $160 a month across the state. And that is more than enough to cover the fixed costs of the grid. The other mistake that the Public Advocate's Office made was in assuming that there hadn't been any benefit to rooftop solar in terms of saving the utilities having to build and buy stuff. And that's just baloney. So when you add all these things up, not only is there not an $8.5 billion cost to other people, but rooftop solar users actually saved everyone in the state $1.49 billion in 2024. I'm a renter. I don't have rooftop solar on my apartment building, in part because the governor vetoed the bill that would have made it easier for my landlord to do that. I recognize that my bills are lower because there are neighbors of mine who have rooftop solar, who have taken their load off of the grid and support the homes around them by sending energy to those homes when they have a little bit extra to share. And that is a benefit to me because it means the utilities are building less, they are buying less, and then I have to pay for less of that. So it's a huge benefit to the grid as a whole. So that's where that correction comes from. And in correcting that lie from the Public Advocate's Office, which was then repeated by the California Public Utility Commission in this little circle of repeated lies, when that is debunked, thoroughly taken apart, piece by piece, actual numbers put in, you then see that rooftop solar actually saved everybody $1.49 billion in 2024.
And this is the dot that you're saying that the legislators on this hearing, and by the way, who are the legislators? What's the name of the committee?
Right. So this is the State Energy Senate Committee on Utilities, Energy, and Communications. On the Senate side, they lumped those three things together. So there was a little bit of a conversation in that hearing about AT&T and like mobile lines, for example, and also about water. But the real bulk of the conversation was about electricity and the fact that our electric rates in California are way, way, way higher than anywhere else in the country, despite having energy efficiency that should have helped these prices be lowered. And one point I want to make here, Dave, and I think we should maybe spend a minute just kind of unpacking this for folks, is that the California Energy Commission was also there as one of the speakers in this panel, and they made the good point that energy efficiency programs have been a huge benefit to California because it means that we are using less electricity. And because we're using less electricity, that's less that the utilities need to build, buy, move, maintain, and that saves everyone. And they gave the example of people turning off the lights. And you have a really good way of explaining how turning off the lights is just like rooftop solar. So I wonder if you could maybe walk people through that.
I'm a little flabbergasted that lawmakers are not connecting this dot. It would seem like this is really, really important. Rooftop solar, for our listeners, I think you might know this, but it's exactly like turning off the lights. You put solar panels on your roof. It makes electricity. Some of the time that electricity powers the things in your home, right? So then you don't have to buy the electricity from the utility. You just use the solar energy that is made on your roof. Sometimes your panels make more energy than you need to use in your house at any one particular point in time. When that happens, the energy goes out to the wires and it goes to one of your neighbors. And then your neighbors use that electricity. The utility sells that, for those of us on NEM1 and NEM2, which is most of us, the utility sells that energy to your neighbor at the retail rate and then gives you a bill credit at the retail rate. The utility doesn't make any money on the electricity. They don't lose any money on the electricity. And because, as you mentioned before, solar customers do pay a bill. In fact, it's an average of about $80 to $160 a month. We also pay for the cost of transporting that electricity to our neighbor. So the only thing that happens at the end of the day is that the utility does not have to deliver as much electricity. to me or to my neighbor, which is the exact same thing as if we turned off the lights. So what's crazy is you're saying in this hearing, and at least one branch of the government that was asked to do a report is acknowledging that turning off the lights and other forms of energy efficiency causes people to buy less electricity from the utility. And they acknowledge that that means the utility doesn't have to spend as much money on stuff, which saves all ratepayers money. And yet at the same time, they're saying that rooftop solar is not doing that. Like, where's the disconnect? How do they make that claim, or how do they get away with making rooftop solar just seem different than that?
Well, I think this is the question. And essentially, it's not how do they, but how dare they make that claim? So you have these various agencies defending energy efficiency tooth and nail, as they should. Kudos to the California Energy Commission for saying, hands off our energy efficiency programs. And here's all the benefit that we have put towards the grid through these programs. Excellent job. And it wasn't the California Energy Commission, I just want to clarify, saying that, rooftop solar is at fault. And perhaps there is.
I mean, to have like more than one hostile agency.
Right.
Rooftop solar, that would be terrible.
It would be terrible. Right.
Right.
Right. Exactly. So here you have various organizations and individuals who were present defending energy efficiency as a way to help lower bills. But then in the very same breath, you have the utilities and others, regulators, blaming rooftop solar users for doing the exact same thing. Rooftop solar users are making their own energy, using their own energy, and paying shipping and handling on the energy that gets sent to their neighbors. That's all good stuff. There's nothing negative about any of those pieces. And what I wished had happened is that legislators dug into utility claims that rooftop solar is at fault here. There was not a single legislator who pushed back against the claim that rooftop solar users are at fault. There were several who got half the picture, that the real problem is increased utility spending, driving up rates, and then creating billions of dollars in profits for these utilities. Legislators did a great job of really grilling on that. But I didn't hear any legislator give a full-throated defense of rooftop solar and say, no. Rooftop solar is exactly the same as energy efficiency. We need those two things, both to help hit our state's clean energy goals and to help make the grid less expensive. These are good things that help us use less energy to get us closer towards the very goal of affordability we are here to talk about. And they didn't. So if you're listening to this podcast, this might be a great moment to reach out to your legislator, even if they weren't on this committee, and tell them what you think. That yelling at rooftop solar users who did the right thing, who are heroes, who is helping this system work better than it was before, they're not at fault. And that where they need to look is at the monopoly utilities, who are pointing every which way other than at themselves and their own shareholders for what is happening here.
I mean, people should absolutely do that because it's so crazy. I mean, just again, to summarize, it's quite simple. Rates are high because the utilities have spent like drunken sailors building poles and wires that it turns out we didn't really need because peak electricity demand was flat. It was flat because Californians are becoming more efficient. Californians conserve, and a lot of Californians are putting solar panels on their roof, so the utility doesn't have to deliver as much electricity to people. And yet, the utility still went and spent like drunken sailors. The regulators let them spend like drunken sailors because the regulators are appointed by politicians like Governor Newsom who take millions of dollars from the utilities themselves. And so now rates are high. And the solution, we can point fingers at all that, but the better thing would be, let's bring rates down. The way to do that is to spend less on poles and wires. One way to spend less on poles and wires is to double down on helping people be more efficient, conserve, and encourage people to put solar panels on their roof. And the only entity that loses out on that is the utilities because they'll make less profit on this whole thing.
Right, exactly.
And so this is so simple. And rooftop solar is just so exactly like energy efficiency and conservation that it is just mind-blowing to me that the CPUC and others get away with somehow making it like the two things are different when they're not. And so is there any argument that that you think like they would make that like holds any water as to how somehow rooftop solar is different than efficiency or conservation?
Absolutely not. And I think the reason that they're zeroing in on rooftop solar lies in a much longer story about how we got here. As you said, Dave, it's so simple. Rooftop solar is hugely popular. We know. Our neighbors know. Like, if you talk to somebody in the Home Depot parking lot, they're like, yeah, rooftop solar, this is great. Like, we know. We have an instinct that rooftop solar is really good. It's good for our planet. It's good for our wallets. It's good. And yet, we have our legislators, we have some reporters, not all legislators, not all reporters, but we have these, like, thought leaders, a group of them, who have been sucked in to this utility lie that it is rooftop solar that is causing this affordability crisis. Dave, I wonder if you might just take a moment and walk people through how we got here, because I think that's what lies at the reason why legislators and these other groups that were present at this hearing are trying to pin this on rooftop solar while somehow thinking of energy efficiency as something different. The point I made earlier about the fact that the Public Advocate's Office had made this wildly inflated claim about rooftop solar, that was a trend that was started on purpose by the utilities. And I think folks really need to know that. And then I think we can help people understand how that connects to why this hearing took place.
And let's just say, by the way, people can always visit our website, www.solarrights.org. There is a button right at the top that says Learn More. We've got lots of articles about all of this. But I would say before you go to any of those articles, take action, contact your legislators. We have a take action right there on the homepage. And we do encourage you, as Cailey, you said earlier, to not just learn about this issue, but make your voice heard. And, you know, there's 2 million solar customers and millions more who want it and support it. And this is a hugely popular thing. And, you know, lawmakers need to understand that they got to get on the right side of the public sentiment and the right side of the consumer on this. But how did we get here? I'm continuing to find more and more documents to try to get to the origin story of the lie. But it seems like around 2012, the utility industry, not just here in California, but around the country, was seeing that rooftop solar was becoming more popular. The cost of putting solar panels in was starting to drop by a lot. And they were seeing sales go down. I mean, you know, just less people were buying their product. And importantly, and they acknowledged this in some of these early documents that we've been able to see from, you know, starting in 2012, is they recognized that overall, when people use less energy, and especially with rooftop solar, they're going to have less ability to justify building poles and wires, which is the primary way that they make their profits. And so we have a 2012 presentation that was leaked. It was a board meeting presentation, a presentation to the utility industry's national trade group. So it was a confidential presentation, and it basically goes through all of this, that they were like really alarmed about rooftop solar, but also acknowledged that it's incredibly popular. So they had to come up with a story, essentially, to try to make rooftop solar go from being the golden child to the culprit, to the scapegoat.
Right.
So you start to see that, and that's where you start to see the phrase cost shift, which I think, as we know, we don't use that word a lot because it doesn't really mean anything. It's something only insiders use, but it's the word that insiders use to describe blaming rooftop solar for high rates. That's all you really need to know. But you see that that's the word that they decided to use. And in that same year, they got a former Edison, SoCal Edison executive who became a state legislator, Stephen Bradford, to introduce a bill to essentially, and the bill essentially instructed the CPUC to research this cost shift. So essentially what they did was, and it was a very under the radar bill. It didn't look like much. It was very technically written. But the net result was that they planted essentially the idea of the cost shift into the formal organs of government, including not just the word, but the concept itself. This is important because if you just go back 2 years earlier, before the utilities cooked up this strategy, if you looked at a CPUC report about rooftop solar then, it explicitly went out of its way to note that when people use less energy, that's a benefit to the entire state. So something changed at the CPUC, you know, in just a few short years, and the beginning starts in 2012 when the utilities cook up their strategy at the national level. They bring it to California. They get one of their own who got into government to pass a bill, very technical. Nobody really knew what they were voting on. And then it instructs the CPUC to start to change its thinking and coined the phrase and all that kind of stuff. At the same time, and I'm going to make this short because you can really go on about this thing, they then went to some of their old friends. So if you've ever heard of the National Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, you might think they're a good group because they're an environmental group. If you're kind of a green person, you might go, hey, yeah, maybe you give it to them. But they were actually the group that helped Enron basically change the law that then led to that scandal, and they were never held accountable for it. They've had a cozy relationship with the utility industry going back to the 1970s, and this was no exception. They basically made a deal with the utility industry, and this is, by the way, public. They went to the utility conferences, they did a joint agreement that was basically sounding the alarm that utilities were reduced, that sales were going down because of rooftop solar, and this was a really big problem. And which of course is ridiculous because of the reasons we've talked about. So they got NRDC on board. They started doing that. They have been showering politicians with money since the beginning of time. Since just 2000 alone, they've given $1 billion to politicians, nonprofit organizations, academics, trade groups, chambers of commerce, right? So they've just been spreading money.
Can we just say that again, Dave? Sorry, they gave how many dollars?
$1 billion since the year 2000.
Billion with a B, folks. Billion with a B is how much they've showered all of these various entities over the past 25 years. That is wild.
Right. So this is happening. They've got now kind of the CPUC starting to change its thinking. And then and so this is on and on and on and on. We can kind of get into the thing, but then the real kind of big breakthrough was the election of Gavin Newsom for them. For one reason or another, and we think the main reason is that Governor Newsom is very close with PG&E's labor union, IBEW. That's when really they got their guy. And so Gavin appoints all of these people onto the CPUC. And by the way, Governor Newsom is the top recipient, sitting lawmaker. He took $2.5 million from the utility industry, mainly to protect himself during the recall. That was the single biggest contributor, and it's the single biggest recipient of this stuff. But then the CPUC then starts changing its tune, and now we get kind of more to recent events in the last 5 years. The next step that the utilities needed was some math to justify the idea of the cost shift. So by this time, they now have a CPUC that's completely captured, more captured than ever before. And the CPUC hires a consulting firm to do math to justify this cost shift claim. The firm they hire is a firm called E3. If you just go to E3's website and you look at their client list, you realize they're a utility consulting firm. All of their clients, for the most part, are PG&E, Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, and other private utilities from around the country. And so, of course, E3 then went and cooked up a methodology that makes it look like rooftop solar is to blame for high rates. And so that becomes now the official government math. And so, you can kind of understand you're a legislator, and even if you're not bought off, right, you can just get really confused, right? Because you have to trust somebody. And even if you know that the CPUC is captured and corrupt, they've got math, right? They've got a group like NRDC who's been completely captured by the utilities, right, saying this thing. You've got Turn, who it just refuses to get their head screwed on straight about this stuff. And so then you start to think, well, maybe rooftop solar is an exception to this whole thing. Maybe it's a problem. And so that's in a nutshell how we got here. And it doesn't mean that all is lost, because as you said, we have actually seen lawmakers speak up about this stuff. But it's just to explain, why is this hard? Like, that's why, is the utilities have a lot of power, which makes it all the more reason why people like you who are listening really do have to be speaking up about this and making sure that lawmakers understand. If you like energy efficiency and conservation, it's no different than rooftop solar. And when customers use less energy, that means the utilities don't have to build as much stuff. And when they don't have to build as much stuff, everyone saves money. The utilities want to build more stuff. So that's why they want to knock off the competition. And that's what this whole thing is all about.
Exactly. And all of that is what led to this Senate hearing. So Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order at the end of last year. So this was the end of 2024, saying, hey, we got to do something about rising rates. It's getting out of control. And so he directed all of the organizations that regulate these things, the California Public Utility Commission, the California Energy Commission, California Air Resources Board, to take a look at their programs and decide what could be changed to try to fix some of these problems. And he specifically singled out rooftop solar customers and rooftop solar programs.
You have a crisis, right? You are the governor of the the fifth largest economy in the world.
Right.
You know, the economy the people are suffering. The economy is suffering because your administration has allowed rate hike after rate hike after rate hike after rate hike, right? And even your predecessors are not blameless here, right? This has been a long problem that has been cooking for a long time.
Right.
And you're now issuing an executive order to go, we're going to stand up for the consumer. We're going to tackle these high electricity prices. And then you have the opportunity to put that down on paper. And instead of saying the problem is we've let the utilities spend like drunken sailors on infrastructure that we didn't need, he blamed rooftop solar, right?
Exactly. That is right. That is exactly right. And then out of that executive order comes this terrible California Public Utility Commission report, which, by the way, we haven't said this yet, but I think it's important for people to know. The California Public Utility Commission is an unelected body of 5 people, all of whom have been appointed by Governor Newsom. So when you see Governor Newsom put out an executive order that says, fix this by changing the programs for rooftop solar, and then you see the California Public Utility Commission come out with this report that says, we should fix this by undoing existing rooftop solar programs, gee, I wonder what the direct connection between those two things might be, right? So that's how we got here. So now you have the California Public Utility Commission, you have other organizations that you just named, you have PG&E, you have TURN, you have NRDC. These were the groups that were on this panel at this table. And again, I think it's development that not all of them blamed rooftop solar for this problem. That is progress. But as you said, why is this hard? Because there is this echo chamber that has been purposefully created by the utilities, by their consulting firm. And I really want to hit again, Dave, the point you made that they hired both a PR firm and a consulting firm to put this lie out there to the public. And I recently was talking with a legislator in a one-on-one lobby meeting. And I said to him, I was like, I go back and I read those slides from that PR firm every year because we have the slides. They were leaked. It's a PowerPoint presentation that this PR firm made for the utilities about how to get this lie out there. And it is wild, folks. Terms we use, language we use, ways we think about this stuff originated in that slide deck. And I remember that legislator saying, like, wow, send me that. I want to see that. So we appreciate everything that you are doing to get this information in front of your legislators. So I want to say again, in the course of this conversation, if you feel yourself going, what can I do about this? This is ridiculous. This is wrong. I want to take action. Your state senators and your state assembly members need to hear from you. These are the folks who have the ability to make real change here, both in terms of energy affordability and in terms of promoting rooftop solar to make it easier for people to get rooftop solar and storage so that we can make the grid more affordable while also hitting our clean energy goals and giving people the freedom and independence of rooftop solar. I think it is interesting that one of the senators actually said in this hearing, if we undermine energy, we undermine freedom. Let that sit with you for a minute there. If we undermine energy, we undermine freedom. That's right. And one of the best ways that people can get freedom and independence when it comes to energy, electricity specifically, is rooftop solar. Nobody owns the sun, and everyone should have a right to make energy from the sun. And that is a right your senators and your assembly members should be defending. And while they do, they should be holding the utilities accountable for the fact that they are the reason that electricity rates are rising.
Seems like an excellent place to stop. That is a really good summary, Cailey, of just what this whole fight is all about. And in the show notes that you can see below us have a bunch of ways with which you can both learn more about the things that we've talked about. Everything we've talked about is on our website. We have citations that you can dig into. We are always very receptive to you just sending us an email at info@solarrights.org if you have any questions. But most importantly, we have some links below where you can take action and communicate with your legislators. This stuff is quite simple, and you don't have to be an expert, but we do need to get this information in front of them. And as you said earlier, Cailey, we need them to connect the dots on all of this stuff and understand the bottom line. When customers use less energy, whether it's from solar panels or from turning off the lights, they are benefiting all ratepayers. This is a good thing. We need to encourage it. That is the way that we're going to bring down the cost of electricity and also cut PG&E and those other utilities down a peg, and have them actually work for the benefit of the public rather than their shareholders. So that's it for today, folks. You've been watching the Solar Rights Alliance podcast, where we talk to you about the freedom and independence of solar. I'm Dave Rosenfeld, the Executive Director of the Solar Rights Alliance.
And I'm Cailey Underhill, Advocacy and Development Director of the Solar Rights Alliance.
Until next time, bye-bye.
Thanks, folks. Bye.